In my previous video on the P-51C horse, I talked about how the US Navy, though swearing off liquid-cooled inline engines in 1921, did keep a close eye on developments on those types of power plant. In the late 1930s, there looked to be a few prospects that seemed promising enough that the Navy planners thought they might be worth putting some investments into. Amongst these was the Lycoming XH14C. Like many other aero engine manufacturers of the 1930s, Lycoming was scrambling to stay ahead of the competition as aircraft engines became increasingly powerful in that decade. In 1933, Lycoming had begun work on an engine, designated as the O1230, that looked to be what today we might describe as a disruptive technology, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine that produced 1,200 horsepower. But what made this new engine special was that in contrast to most rival designs, the O1230 was a horizontally opposed or flat design that made it potentially more aerodynamic, especially if mounted in an aircraft's wings. In fact, despite considerable investment in the development of this engine by the United States Army Air Corps, the engine was problematic and abandoned. But Lycoming weren't about to give up completely with the concept, and so in 1938 they began work on a design that coupled two of the O1230s together to form a 24-cylinder H-block type that would theoretically produce 2,300 horsepower. The Lycoming XH2470. This was potentially a huge deal in the late 1930s for future military aircraft, and both the USAAC and the United States Navy invested in the new power plant's development. At the time, the US Navy had only just started to receive the first of their Brewster F-2 fighters into service, as well as placing orders for the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, but they were already planning on the next generation of fighters for their carrier fleet. And the new, hugely powerful engine, which produced almost twice the horsepower of the F4F's twin wasp radial, seemed like an excellent prospect. On the 30th of June 1941, the US Navy placed orders for their next generation of naval fighters, the F6F Hellcat and the F7F Tigercat twin-engine heavy fighter. What isn't so well remembered was that they also ordered a third aircraft, a theoretically formidable new naval interceptor that, in a break from their avowed tradition, would use the liquid-cooled engine that they had invested in, the Curtiss XF14C. Now I shall say right away that all of the pictures of the XF14C you see in this video are of the later XF14C2 model. And the reason for that is because the Lycoming 24-cylinder engine, spoiler alert, never worked out. To be fair to Lycoming, coupling engines like this was an idea that basically every major aircraft producing country at the time was giving serious consideration to. And indeed, some H-block types were able to eventually get into service, though the vast majority proved to be costly failures. In fact, quite a number of the forgotten aircraft I've covered owe their demise to the optimism placed in H-block engine development and their subsequent mishaps. But to return to the XF14C. Of all-metal construction and equipped with folding wings, the XF14C was planned to have initially 6 50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns in the wings as armament, which was later changed to 4 20mm cannon. This all might seem pretty conventional, but the chosen propeller was not, as the idea was to fit a contra-rotating prop on the aircraft. Curtiss projections were that the aircraft would have a top speed of 374 miles per hour, with an initial climb rate of 2,810 feet per minute. But the Navy's own wind test tunnels of the design led them to conclude that Curtiss was being somewhat optimistic with their assessments. Regardless, things progressed until October 1943, when, with the first of the two ordered prototypes just about finished, the unavoidable problem arose in the fact that the Lycoming engine was not actually available for fitting on the aircraft. After a couple of months of wrangling, the Navy dumped the Lycoming H-block and decided to fit a radial engine that was in keeping with their general philosophy on naval aircraft power plants instead. Having said that, the engine they chose was certainly a beast, a turbo-supercharged variant of the Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone, the engine famously used on the B-29 Super Fortress. This engine, though bulkier than the Lycoming, could produce 2,250 horsepower and was ideally suited for high-altitude combat, leading the Navy to decide that the new aircraft, now designated as the XF14C2, might make a high-altitude fighter. To be honest, it seems that the Navy was just double-checking that they weren't missing out on something special, because by this point, the F-6F Hellcat, which remember had been ordered at the same time as the XF-14C, was carving its legend across the skies of the Pacific as one of the great carrier fighters. The XF-14C, however, was never going to be that. Curtiss were able to make the necessary changes reasonably quickly, and the XF-14C2 was even fitted with contra-rotating propellers. But when it was handed over to the Navy for flight tests in September 1944, it proved to be rather disappointing. Top recorded speed was 398 miles per hour at 32,000 feet, which wasn't anything special considering the other aircraft in development at the time. Additionally, the propeller system caused the aircraft to shudder to an alarming degree. This late in the war, the US Navy was of the opinion that they no longer really needed a high-altitude fighter, and that their existing designs, as well as the newer ones that were coming into service imminently, were more than sufficient for their needs. So they cancelled the XF-14C. Curtiss launched another proposal for an XF-14C3, which would have had a pressurized cockpit and the ability, allegedly, of being able to operate at up to 40,000 feet. The Navy paid for studies to be carried out on this until early 1945, but soon concluded once again that they had no need for this type, and then pulled the plug completely on the project, leaving the one and only XF-14C2 to head for the scrapyard. And that would be that, except for the fact that this aircraft, along with the XP-60, were the last piston engine fighters built by Curtiss, a company that had been at the cutting edge of aviation development since the earliest days of the aeroplane. In fact, the XF-14C represents the sort of issues that had been besetting Curtiss since the 1930s. The company was struggling to stay innovative, especially in comparison to other companies like North American and Bell. Plus, it is arguable that the company was a victim of its own success in that it ended up with far more work than it could comfortably handle during the war, leading to issues in quality control and development. And where Curtiss did try to innovate, which in the case of the XF-14C was represented in betting on a novel power plant and propeller system, that gamble ultimately proved to be a poor one. As a result, the end of the war saw Curtiss, despite being ranked second in terms of the value of contracts awarded to it during the conflict, rapidly fall by the wayside, with the company leaving aircraft production completely in 1948, and the XF-14C as an almost completely forgotten aircraft.